Good morning. Those who've never met me before, I'm David Trobisch. By profession, I'm a New Testament scholar, and I want to talk to you about something that you may never have heard about before. Scholars now know of a gospel book that is probably older than the Gospels that are part of the New Testament. It's exciting for scholars. Let me give you an example. The lectionary reading for today, so that is the reading that is being read on this very Sunday all over the world in most of the churches across many different denominations. And that lectionary reading is taken from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, the verses 1 to 6. You know the drill, a story, and you respond, let it come, let it go, right? A story. Let it come, let it go. It was in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, that year when Pilate was the governor of Judea, and Herod was the tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was the tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene, and the high priests were Annas and Caiaphas. It was at that year that the word of the Lord came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. And he was traveling through the regions around the Jordan, and he was preaching a baptism of repentance and forgiveness of sins, just as the prophet Isaiah in his book of sayings has written down. A voice in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. The valleys are going to be filled, the mountaintops are going to be leveled, crooked streets are going to be made straight, rough surface is going to be made soft, so that all people can see the salvation of the Lord. End of the story, amen. And you say, amen. Thank you. 15th year of Tiberius, Pilate, Herod, Philip, Lysanias, Trachonitis. Woo. Sounds like someone copied it out of a textbook. Well, wouldn't you think so? It's, wouldn't you do that? Wouldn't you, if you had to do something like that, want to get it right, look it up first? No, now we go into Wikipedia, but whatever it was at that time, that's how it reads. Now, the oldest gospel that has survived doesn't have all that. But let's start at the beginning. You may not ever have heard of a gospel that is older than the New Testament, but there is one. And it reads, let me read the first sentence to you. In the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, Jesus went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. Whoa, there's no Pilate there, and no Trachonitis, and no regions of Galilee, no high priests, none of that. All it says is, leaves all of that out, and it says Jesus went down to Capernaum. The same sentence. Now, the gospel that I'm talking about was published by a person whose name is transmitted to us as Marcion of Sinope, which is a city on the Black Sea, and it was very widely read during the first half of the 2nd century. The gospel did not carry the name of an author, like Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or something like that. It was just called, as it seems, Gospel. It was part of a collection of 11 books that consisted of this one Gospel and 10 letters of Paul. Now, the Gospel of Luke, from which we were reading for today's Sunday, was published as part of the 4 Gospel book. We don't have copies of just Luke. We have copies of a 4 Gospel book that begins with Matthew, then followed by Mark, and then Luke, and then John. And we're still puzzled about many of those questions. Why in the world, to begin with, would you publish 4 Gospels? If you try to run a church, it's hard enough to live with one. And it's not like they agree on everything, no? So also we would like to know what was the reason for ordering it like that? Wouldn't it have been smarter, for example, to have Luke as the last one, followed by Acts, so you have the story consistently and not be interrupted by John? There are a lot of things, so why not have the true Gospels? The disciples first, Matthew and John, then followed by the disciples of disciples, Mark and Luke. It is a 4-Gospel book. Luke is always number 3. With very, very few. There are 3 exceptions out of 5,600 copies. And this is where people tried to outsmart the New Testament, and they rearranged it exactly what I said, the true Gospels first, and such, the true disciples first. Now, the text of this Gospel, of Marcion's Gospel, can be reconstructed from the writings of authors who promoted the 4-Gospel book over and against other Gospels, namely by Tertullian and Irenaeus of Lyon. And by promoting the 4-Gospel book as we read it in our New Testament, they had to quote from the other ones, yeah? And Marcion was one they hated with especially. So by trying to point out every single mistake he was making, they basically wrote out the whole Gospel for us. So there's not a manuscript that survived, but the text has survived. And because people have done that independently of each other, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and later on Epiphanius, they all look at the same book, but they don't read each other's literature. You can reconstruct it with a lot of sound scholarly integrity, and if 3 people do the same thing, they end up with 90% of the same reconstruction, and then there are a few where you really don't quite know, was it there, was it not, or such and such. Modern research has always been conflicted, whether Marcion is earlier or later. But recent publications all come down that Marcion is the older text. This is a discussion that has been renewed over the last 15 years. It's probably one of the largest changes in my discipline. I call it my discipline. If you know a little bit about me, I've been invited on the editorial board of the Greek New Testament to produce that edition from which all translations are made. So it has really become, to some extent, my discipline. So when you compare Marcion with the Gospel of Luke, I'm talking about the lectionary reading for today, it actually does seem that someone copied out of a textbook. All these details, so taking a simple sentence, 15th year of Tiberius, and then filling in, using some of the main characters that will show up in the following story. We'll hear about Pilate, we will hear about the high priests, and we will hear, so about Philip, the brother, and who has problems with John the Baptist and such and such. He added names of the contemporaries of Emperor Tiberius, but he also added a quote from Isaiah. He said, now this is what Isaiah wrote in the book of Amos. There will be this voice in the wilderness, and it will say this and this. Why? Well, if you interpret it, it's called New Testament for a reason. Yeah, so the New Testament fulfills what the Old Testament has projected. So why not point it out? Yeah, good. I'll do that in my lectures all the time. I try to connect to things that you may already know. Fair enough. But then he also added this story, and the story then continues in Luke by talking about John the Baptist, what he was preaching, he was wandering around. And also, that was not there in Marcion at this point. And the story then continues that Jesus is going to be baptized, so it gives more authority to Jesus. And he adds a genealogy, and he adds this and this and this at this part. So Marcion jumps from verse 3.1 to chapter 4, verse 30. So there's a lot missing that was inserted on this point. But when was it inserted? Surely later. The 4 Gospel clearly exists around the year 150. When we go through our manuscripts and the first quotes, or where the authors are quoted, which is part, or the number 4 is quoted for the Gospels, then we know we're talking about this. But you can't go further back than 150 from what we know now, which is actually pretty good. We even know the textbook that the author was using to fill in that data. It's Josephus. And as we continue to read Luke and the book of Acts, we will find Josephus written out over and over again. Now, Josephus published his books between the year 70 and 100. So this was popular reading. If you wanted to read something about that time period, you would pick up Josephus. You were a Christian in the 2nd century in Rome or in Syria or in Alexandria, that's the kind of thing you would read. You know what? It still is. If we want to know something about the 1st century in Palestine, Josephus is our go-to source. Of course, if you think that Luke was written very early, you would think it was written before Josephus or at the same time, and then there's no real mystery that they have the same thing, because this is exactly how it happened, right? So you see how painful it sometimes is when new insights come in my discipline of New Testament, that we sometimes have to take steps that hurt. But the church has been very good at doing this. It just always takes a little longer than it does for scholars. But if someone took the oldest gospel and edited it, how would they know anything about the real Jesus? And who tells us that the oldest gospel, Marcion's gospel, got it right? Just because it's the oldest, it doesn't have to be the best. We wouldn't have any court cases. If there's a car accident, you don't know what's happening, you get eyewitnesses. Okay, then you know what's happened? You don't. They might be lying, especially if you caused the accident. I grew up a Lutheran. We Lutherans are expected to preach about a passage from the Christian Bible. In our printout for this Sunday, it's not called lectionary, it's called wisdom lesson. And I've been joining you and worshiping with you to know that it's not always from the Bible. But we Lutherans do it differently. We're strongly encouraged to use the lectionary reading for a specific Sunday. This selection has been made and transmitted for at least 1,500 years. So Augustine already writes about it. It might be older than that, which would be the 5th century. So it may be longer than that. And there's something holy about it, that every Sunday, everywhere in the church, you read the same passages. Or let me say it in another way around. We are not held to preach about the oldest gospel. We Lutherans are not also the truest. If I'm really interested in historical Jesus research, I will also look at the Gospel of Thomas. I will look at every kind of information, at archaeology of all kinds. This is not what we're supposed to do. We're not expected to give history lessons. But Dr. Roger Ray, your pastor, is on vacation. God bless him. We wish him well. And this is not a Lutheran church. So things happen. I can get away with a few historical remarks. But still, if someone took the oldest gospel and edited it, how would they know about the real Jesus? And who tells us that the oldest gospel, Marcion's gospel, got it right? This question is there. Who is the real Jesus? The writer of Marcion's gospel thought he knew the real Jesus. The writer of the gospel according to Luke also thought he knew the real Jesus, as did the writer of the gospel of Matthew and the gospel of Mark, the gospel of John, and let's not forget Paul. And you also know who the real Jesus is. And of course, I do as well. I even get paid for it. So we can all tell you what the real Jesus was and is. But each one tells it differently. Gospel of Matthew, for example, Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem. It gives the genealogy. They never had to move there. They've always been there. But in Luke, Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth. They just briefly visit Bethlehem. And the Gospel of John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word, and nothing was created without the Word, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. Nothing was created without the Word is clearly a reference to the creation of the world, when God says, it will be light, and it was light. Everything that God says, the Word, becomes reality. So Jesus was already there when the world was created. The Gospel of John doesn't need a story about Bethlehem, doesn't have one. He's just a guy from Nazareth. Mark couldn't care less, doesn't say anything about it. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus comes down and blesses the disciples and sends them out, and he says, I will be with you to the end of time, I will never leave you. In the Gospel of Luke, at the end, they meet on Easter Sunday, and afterwards he walks out and is lifted up to heaven and disappears. He leaves. It's exactly the opposite of the Gospel of Matthew. And so on and so forth. In the Gospel of Marcion, by the way, how does that end? He just walks away. The first sentence, he walked down to Capernaum, and at the end, he just walks away. Neither ascension, nor a big statement, nor anything. I wouldn't like that either, huh? Let's write another ending. We here, as a community, and I've worshipped with you for a long time, it was a very important experience for me. We also know that Jesus fed the hungry, and so we help with the soup kitchen. We're aware that Jesus healed the sick, so many of us were very much engaged in healthcare reform and trying to make health accessible, and we will keep walking that path until it's as good as we can possibly do it as a community. And when we hear the Syrian story of the Syrian Phoenician woman, many of us might read it differently than other Christians do. Thinking about the Syrian crisis, I certainly do. Germany is accepting 10 to 15,000 people coming in every day. Here, I live in a country and also have an American passport that is ashamed of 10,000 a year. I couldn't believe it, as if they couldn't handle it. For us, at least, the story of Jesus is quite interesting. When the Syrian Phoenician, she doesn't ask for herself. Like our modern people coming, they ask for their families. And she says, I have the sick kid, please heal it. And she says, come on, I'm not called to work. Very specific. Yeah, we heard those voices. I'm not called to serve them. And then the lady says, well, at least treat him like you treat your dog. And Jesus said, oh, that makes sense, and heals the kid. Yeah. It's quite a story. Well, the way I interpret it, and I'm sure many of you interpret, is, do you know when you will be on the streets? Do you know when you might need help? Many of us have been in situations where we completely relied on the friendship and the help of those who love us and who care for us. And I have 3 passports. I'm a foreigner everywhere. I appreciate it. Marcion, who collected and published, he did the right thing. He followed the real Jesus. Those who added Marcion into Luke also did it with the full of their heart. Those who produced the 4 Gospel book also tried to bring out the real Jesus, just as we help in the food pantry. Those who put the lectionary readings together, not knowing it would last for such a long time, they also tried to find and convey the center of what Jesus was about. The truth, I'm afraid to tell you, as an enlightened, Wikipedia calls me a liberal German theologian, very, very interesting. And liberal in Germany means something very different than in America. It's a school of thought from the 19th century where it assumes that everyone has a spiritual side, and in some ways Hindus and Muslims and so all have the same access to the divinity. But here liberal mostly means sexual ethics. Yeah. That's what I've learned so far, that you're open that homosexuals are also real people, for example, and so on. I won't go into that. And the theologian, I'm not quite so sure. Theologians I've always been skeptic about because they know so much about God. Mm-hmm. And I always felt I have hardly anything to say about it. Like when my wife tells me she doesn't understand me, I have to respond, I don't understand myself either. How in the world would I be able to explain God to you? Not even the most intimate relationships I can explain. But nevertheless, in my capacity as a scholar of the New Testament, the best answer I can give you about the real Jesus is that it lives in us. The real Jesus is the one you know. Story? A story. In the 7th year of President Obama, when Jay Nixon was the governor of Missouri, and Billy Long was the representative of the 7th district of this, when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running for presidency, and when Pope Francis was in charge of the Vatican, it was in that year that Jesus came again. Where do you think he came? Do you think he went to the Vatican to have a chat with his Paul Francis? No. Do you think he went to Salt Lake City to talk to the Mormons? All the places Jesus could have gone, he decided to come to Missouri, to Springfield, Missouri. And it was a Sunday morning, so he walked all the way out to Cherry Street and walked in here, opened the door, and was right in the middle of the Sunday service. The door opens, he comes out, and with his luck, there was a New Testament guy standing there. And we're paid to recognize Jesus when we see him. So immediately he stepped away from the microphone and said, "Now, this is the real Jesus." So Jesus stood up there and began to talk and had questions and so, and then all of a sudden, you didn't have to say much, because Jesus can look into our heart and he can read our thoughts, and he knew immediately that there are some there who think that this is just a ghost. Not a real thing. So he stepped down and had some bread there and a good sip of red wine, just to prove to everyone, no, this is not a ghost. You would see it come in and flow out. No, it's a real human being. And then he could see the others thought, yeah, sure, a human being, but it's just one of those imposters who had enough of those. And Jesus could read their thoughts in their heart. And so he said, "May the real Jesus please stand up. Please rise." And then he said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I will be among them." End of the story. Amen. Amen. End of the sermon.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.